Hey, tonight we're diving into one of those corners of history that most textbooks barely whisper about, the everyday lives of women working in Victorian brothels. I know it sounds like a strange choice for a bedtime story, but honestly, it's one of the most revealing, human slices of the past you'll ever hear. Real women, real struggles, and a side of survival tends to politely overlook. All right, find that perfect cozy spot, take a nice slow breath, and let yourself melt into the bed or couch or wherever you're curling up tonight. Because we're about to wander back to the grimy, bustling streets of Victorian London. And by the end of this, you'll be very, very thankful for your warm blanket and modern plumbing. You open your eyes to a dim, shivering gray light filtering through a thin curtain that doesn't quite keep out the early chill. The breath in your lungs feels sharper than it should, touched by cold that seems to have seeped straight through the crumbling walls. A faint scent of damp wallpaper, aging horsehair, and that cloying lavender water, always trying to cover something earthier, hangs about you. Underneath your body, the mattress dips uncomfortably where countless others have laid before. It's stuffed with horsehair that's long since shifted into uneven lumps, pressing against your hips and shoulders no matter how you turn. Somewhere beneath you, floorboards creak as if sighing under the weight of years. The thin wool blanket, rough against your skin, clings more out of habit than true warmth. When you shift slightly, you become acutely aware of how the sheet smells, stale with a ghost of floral powder and something human, a scent that never fully leaves no matter how often the linens are boiled. You draw the blanket tighter, trying to cling to the last vestiges of comfort, though you know it's time to start the day. Outside, the city is already alive. Hooves clatter on cobblestones, iron-rimmed wheels rattle past, and a street hawker's muffled call carries up, "Fresh bread, hot loaves." A breath fogs gently before your lips. The coal fire in your little grate hasn't been lit since yesterday afternoon, strictly rationed to evenings when the house bustles with visitors and the need to maintain illusions grows strongest. You turn your head and see the floral paper on the wall curling at the edges, darkened by moisture that sneaks in through cracks. Somewhere beyond that thin barrier is all of London, with its towering stacks of brick and slate pouring coal smoke into the heavy sky. A deep breath fills your chest with air touched by soot and dampness, and you let it out slow, hoping it might steady you. Across the narrow room, a girl still sleeps in the other bed. She's bundled into her own blanket, face half buried, only the slow rise and fall of her shoulders revealing her gentle drift through dreams. Her hair spills across the pillow, bright against the drab surroundings. You've come to rely on that quiet rhythm of her breathing, a small reminder that you're not entirely alone in this life. The mattress beneath you groans as you push yourself upright. The chill attacks instantly, drawing goosebumps across your arms. You let the blanket slide to your waist and rub your hands briskly along your shoulders. It doesn't help much, but the movement at least wakes you further. With a small exhale, you stand. The floorboards are cold enough to sting, and you almost dance from foot to foot before snatching your wool shawl from the bedpost. Wrapping it around your shoulders, you breathe in its faintly oily scent, a mix of lanolin and skin that somehow means safety after so long. There's a chipped pitcher on the little table between the beds. You reach out, breaking the delicate film of ice on top with a finger, flinching at the bite. Then you pour a little into the basin and splash it over your face. The shock forces a gasp from your chest, but it clears the last clinging fog of sleep. Water drips down your neck, sliding beneath your nightdress in bright trails of cold. The sounds of the house are stirring too. Somewhere below, a heavy footstep passes on the stair, almost certainly Mrs. Winters doing her morning round. From further off comes the crackle of kindling catching, followed by the sharper scent of coal smoke. The kitchen fire's being coaxed to life, promising at least a little warmth to come. You imagine the old cook bustling about, rolling dough or stirring something thick and savory in a pot. That thought settles warmly in your belly, even if breakfast is still a long half-hour away. You move to the small mirror propped on the chest, catching sight of your own reflection. The glass is old and speckled with black where the silver backing has fled, so your face appears slightly haunted, fading at the edges. Still, it's enough to see the way your cheeks hollow when you tighten your lips, how your dark hair spills loose around your shoulders, slightly tangled from sleep. You touch it, feeling its softness, and then begin the slow process of smoothing it back. Each stroke of your fingers is measured, more to calm yourself than from any real need to tidy up just yet. A soft creak behind you makes you glance around. The girl in the other bed, Lily, though that's not the name she was born with, is shifting, her arms slipping free from the blanket. You watch for a moment, almost protective, before turning back to the mirror. In this stillness, you let your eyes close for a beat longer. Your breath slows on purpose, in through your nose, filling your chest until your ribs push slightly against the shawl, then out through parted lips. It's a small ritual, one you picked up somewhere along the way to soothe the tightness that sometimes coils in your belly for no clear reason. When your eyes open again, they're sharper, more present. The city awaits, sprawling out beyond that dim window, but for now, you're here, in this small rented room, surviving another morning. Outside the window, the day has grown a little brighter. Not sunny, London rarely indulges in true sunshine, but the light has shifted from gray to a weary sort of pearl. You hear the playful shouts of children running down the street, the sharp bark of a dog. Somewhere a cart driver yells at his horse, and the wheels rumble away. Life goes on just outside your thin wall, oblivious to the small universe of women's stories contained within this house. You pull your shawl tighter and look around the room, memorizing its worn familiarity. There's the table with its pale water stain, the battered chair with a leg slightly shorter than the rest, the single cracked cup that has become entirely yours. In a way, all these battered things are anchors. They are yours simply because no one else would want them. The boards creak again as you step over to the washstand. The pitcher is heavy in your hand. You pour a little more water into the basin, then brace yourself and sponge off your arms and neck. The chill slices deep, but it's honest at least, pure in a way the city air rarely manages to be. By the time you've finished, small droplets are racing down your spine, and your skin prickles furiously. You wrap your shawl more snugly around you and stand there for a moment, listening to the house. Soft voices drift up from below, Betsy the maid perhaps, murmuring something to Mrs. Winters. A door opens and closes somewhere, hinges giving a little squeal of complaint. This place is never silent, and you find a curious comfort in that. Silence, you've come to believe, belongs more to graveyards and lonely roads than to places where people still breathe and hope for tomorrow. You run your palms slowly down the front of your nightdress, feeling the coarse cotton against your fingertips, then let them fall loose at your sides. Another breath fills your chest, deeper this time, and as it slides out of you, you feel a small knot between your shoulders begin to loosen. There will be time for everything else: dressing, tending to chores, smoothing down the facade you're expected to wear once customers begin arriving. But this moment, this first honest piece of the day, belongs only to you. And so you stand quietly by the window, eyes half closed, listening to London exhale around you, feeling your own heart echo that slow, persistent rhythm. You stand there by the narrow window, feeling the cool pain beneath your fingertips, and in that stillness, your thoughts slip backward, almost without permission. It happens most mornings, this quiet drift into wondering how it all turned out this way. Who you are now is not quite who you were once, though the pieces all trace back to the same small beginnings. Your name isn't really Mary, though that's what everyone here calls you. The house finds it simpler to give each girl a neat, forgettable name, one that slips easily off the tongue, that sounds pleasant in a gentleman's ear. You took it without protest, as so many others did before you. Names in this place are like dresses, borrowed, fitted for purpose, shed when worn through. If you close your eyes, you can almost recall the first mornings of your life, somewhere far from these crowded streets. A cottage crouched by a hedgerow, the smell of bread thick in the air, your mother's hands dusted with flour, her voice low and gentle as she urged your brothers out to the fields. There had been laughter there, sunlight spilled across a worn wooden table, small dreams growing wild alongside the cabbages in the patch by the door. But time is a cunning thief. It stole your mother first, a cough that deepened, then softened to a silence that never lifted. Your father followed after in his own way, shoulders bowing under debts that twisted him into quiet despair, until one season he simply didn't rise with the dawn anymore. Then it was just you and your brothers, who tried as best they could to keep things stitched together. But boys grow restless when there is hunger, and work calls loudest where the pay comes quickest. They scattered, one to the docks in Bristol, another to the tin mines, the youngest still nearly a child when he took work with a drover. Letters arrived for a time, thin and smudged, heavy with promises to send for you when they could. But the world swallows young men in need of wages, and soon enough even those fragile scraps of hope ceased coming. So you packed what little you owned into a bundle one gray dawn and walked to the road that led toward London. It seemed simple then, sensible even. Work was plentiful in the city, they said, for girls who could sew or read or keep a household. You believed them, because belief was all you had to keep your feet moving when the miles stretched long and your stomach twisted on itself.
And for a brief while, it even seemed true. He found a position in a cramped room above a dressmaker's shop, bent over cloth until your shoulders burned, until your vision blurred and needles pricked your fingers raw. The work was honest. It was also relentless. The coins you earned were barely enough to pay for a bed in a room that smelled of mold and to keep bread on the shelf. Each morning you woke feeling somehow smaller than before, as though the city was slowly wearing you away with its press of bodies, its roaring carriages, its endless appetite for your labor. It's strange how clearly you remember the moment you understood this path would only ever run downhill. You had been working 14 hours that day, trying to finish a gown for a lady who would never know your name. The lamp's poor light danced shadows across the cloth, and your hands shook from cold and exhaustion. When you pricked your finger yet again, a bead of blood swelled bright and fat, falling to stain the silk. You stared at that mark, oddly mesmerized, realizing it would cost more than you earned in a week to replace that scrap of ruined fabric. That was the measure of your life. A single drop from your fingertip, worth less than the stain it left behind. A soft sound pulls you back, your roommate stirring under her blanket, a muffled sigh escaping her as she shifts position. You turn from the glass entirely, moving toward the table where your comb waits. Its teeth are missing in places, worn smooth by years of pulling through tangles. As you lift it, you catch a glimpse of your reflection once more. Not the laughing child in the sunlit cottage, nor the hollow-cheeked seamstress bent over fine gowns that would never be hers, but this woman in between, someone made of all those pieces, stitched together by necessity, who still rises each morning to greet the uncertain day. The comb moves steadily through your hair, smoothing the sleep from each dark strand as though untangling more than just knots. With every pull, faint memories surface. The bitter tang of lamp oil, the way your back cramped after hours hunched over a narrow table, the smell of hot iron pressed to seams to shape fabric meant for women who lived lives far removed from yours. Those early days in London blur together into one long seam, stitched by hunger and repetition. It was a small shop on a crooked lane,
run by a mistress whose eyes seemed to count every breath you took as a potential waste of her money. You arrived with hands still soft from country work, milking, scrubbing floors, twisting bread dough, tasks that were hard but honest in their outcome. Needlework was different. It demanded your eyes as much as your fingers, and both strained under the meager glow of a single lamp that smoked if you turned the wick too high. The shop was forever dim, smelling of scorched fabric, wax, and the stale breath of too many girls bent together over the same boards. You remember the sharp bite of the first real winter you faced there. London's damp cold found every gap in your thin bodice, soaked into your skin until your bones felt waterlogged. Your hands cracked along the knuckles, split open in tiny, stubborn mouths that wept when you curled them. A smear of blood on white muslin became a daily risk, one that set your heart racing each time you saw that telltale rust bloom where it shouldn't. The mistress kept a keen eye for such accidents. Each stain was a cost, docked from wages that could ill afford the loss. It was endless, this work. Dresses for the daughters of merchants, ball gowns for the wives of men who signed papers worth more than you would see in 10 years. They arrived in bright carriages, women with laughter tinkling like crystal as they lifted their skirts to step over the muck of the street. They never looked at you directly, never wondered who cut and pinned and hemmed the satin that would swirl around their ankles under chandeliers you'd never glimpse.
The hours bled into each other. You woke in the dark, your breath rising in white ghosts over the rented mattress, and lay down again only after the streets outside fell silent. The shop offered a single lantern after dusk, its flame too weak to fill the cavernous gloom, so your world was forever half in shadow. Sometimes you squinted so long your vision seemed to pulse, and patterns danced across your eyes even when you closed them. By the end of each day, your shoulders ached as though weights hung from them, and when you lay down at last, your back refused to flatten, still curled from the hours at the table. And the pay. You thought you understood poverty back home, where meals grew thinner after poor harvests and shoes were mended past dignity. But here, your weekly coins could vanish in 2 days on stale bread, a hunk of dripping to smear across it, a length of coal to keep frost from settling into your bones overnight. It never stretched far enough. Your belly often gnawed at itself, a hollow growl echoing inside as you pushed the needle through cloth again and again, hoping the sound wouldn't betray you to the mistress. You tried, in those early months, to cling to the bright thread of pride that you worked honestly. It mattered to your mother's memory, that belief in honest labor, in earning the crust that kept you upright. Even as your ribs began to show under the thin camise, even as your skin lost its country bloom for something paler, almost translucent in the poor light, you repeated that refrain to yourself like a prayer. Honest work, honest wages, honest hunger. But winter in London has a particular cruelty, and it showed no care for your moral fortitude. You still remember, clearer than you'd like, the night you pricked your finger so deeply it welled up red and fat, falling in a perfect bead onto the delicate white linen you'd been trusted to embroider. It bloomed there like a tiny accusation. When you brought the piece to the mistress, your breath caught in your throat. Her mouth twisted in that pinched way that promised a fine deducted, maybe 2, and the hiss of her displeasure cut sharper than any needle. Later that evening, you crouched in your rented room by candle stump, pressing a rag to your bleeding fingertip and trying not to count how many meals would vanish for that slip. The air felt heavy with damp, curling your hair into sticky wisps at your temples. Your stomach cramped, a tight, mean knot that refused to let go. That was when you first truly understood how thin the line was, How close honest work lay to the slow fade of starving. How easily one drop of blood could tilt your world.
And even so, come dawn, you washed your face in icy water, wrapped your shawl tighter, and walked back to that shop, because there was nowhere else to go. Because your brothers were gone to their own unknown corners, because country doors that once stood open to you were shut now by distance and time. Because what choice does a girl alone truly have in a city that never pauses to ask her name before swallowing her whole? You kept stitching, hands raw, eyes gritty, heart growing more hollow with each finished seam. And in that growing emptiness, a question began to echo, quiet but relentless. How long until the last bit of you was stitched out, sold off one tiny piece at a time? It was one of those nights that seemed to press down on you with its weight, when the air in your small rented room felt more like damp wool than anything fit to breathe. The candle you'd scraped enough coin together to buy was burning low, its stubby flame dancing in the draft that wormed its way through the cracked window frame. Your work had piled high beside you, handkerchiefs to be edged, delicate hems to be stitched, but your hands had gone numb long before, stiff and clumsy in the cold. Each time you tried to draw the needle through, it slipped, pricking your raw fingertips so fresh dots of blood joined the faded scars of countless others. Your belly was hollow, echoing with the memory of meals you hadn't had. You'd managed nothing but weak tea since the day before, and the taste of that thin liquid still lingered bitter at the back of your mouth. As you bent over your sewing, your breath misted, reminding you with each faint cloud how winter clawed at the edges of your life. Then a knock startled you, sharp against the door that barely held to its hinges. Your heart lurched painfully. The landlady? Come for rent? A neighbor with complaints about the thin walls and your candle burning too late? You didn't dare call out, just pulled your shawl closer, almost hoping whoever it was would leave. But the handle turned and in slipped a familiar figure that made something loosen inside you at once. Jane. Her name still tasted of easier days. You'd worked alongside her once in that cramped shop, sharing whispered jokes over tangled threads, hands brushing as you passed scissors back and forth. She disappeared months ago, quietly, and you'd wondered then if she'd simply given up, if the city had finally ground her down until there was nothing left to try for.
But here she stood, framed by the flickering light, her cheeks rounder than you remembered, her eyes bright. Her shawl was thicker, her dress newer, not fine, not like the satins you sewed for strangers, but warm-looking, the wool close woven and clean. And in her hands she held a small parcel wrapped in cloth that steamed at the corners. "Mary," she breathed, closing the door quickly against the draft. "I brought you something." You were too surprised to speak as she crossed the narrow space and pressed the bundle into your hands. Heat soaked instantly into your cold skin. You fumbled open the corners of the cloth and stared. A meat pie, still warm, its crust golden and faintly cracked, promising rich juices inside. The smell was nearly too much. It hit you so suddenly, savory, fatty, real, that your mouth flooded and tears sprang unbidden to your eyes. Jane laughed softly, though her gaze was gentle, not mocking. "Eat, please. I remember well enough what these rooms feel like." You didn't need urging. You sank onto the edge of your bed, balancing the pie on your knees, and tore into it, trying for grace but failing entirely. Hot gravy spilled over your fingers, and bits of meat caught between your teeth, and you didn't care. Each bite was a relief so deep it was almost painful. Jane sat beside you in the cramped silence, watching with an understanding that needed no words. When finally you paused, the edge of hunger dulled just enough to breathe properly again, she reached out and smoothed a lock of hair from your forehead. "I've found a place, Mary. she said after a long moment. "A house off the Haymarket. It's what it is. A house for gentlemen, but it's clean. There's regular meals, real doctor visits, coal for the fires. The madam runs it strict but fair. No beatings, no drunken brutes forcing more than what's paid. And you'd make in one night what you struggle for all week with this." Her hand brushed lightly over the pile of handkerchiefs and unfinished seams. Your stomach gave a traitorous lurch at the thought. Part of it was just the food settling at last, but something else stirred too, a dangerous, almost hungry curiosity. You dropped your gaze, ashamed. "I was brought up proper," you whispered, though even to your own ears the words sounded tired. "My mother, she'd have—" Jane squeezed your hand, gently enough that it didn't feel like pressure, just presence. "Your mother would have wanted you fed and warm, not dead of the cold or coughing up blood from damp rooms. Times change, Mary, and there's kindness there, more than I found at that workshop. You'd be surprised how many of us come from good families, taught to fear the very thing that might keep us alive." You couldn't look at her. Instead, your eyes traced the uneven boards of the floor, the candle stuttering in its puddle of wax, the cracked basin with its rim of ice. All the markers of a life lived close to breaking. A single week's wages gone for one mistake on a rich lady's bodice. A single illness enough to put you begging in the streets where men might take what they pleased without paying at all. Finally, you exhaled, long and slow, the way your mother once did when steeling herself to scold you. "Tell me about it," you murmured. "This house." And so Jane did. In a low voice that curled around the small room, she painted careful pictures of a narrow building kept scrubbed and respectable on the outside, of women with faces less gaunt than your own, of stews thick with barley served each evening, of beds turned down with warmed bricks in winter, of rules certainly, but also of routine, of a sort of safety. Her words weren't flowery. She didn't promise happiness or wealth, only survival, only a little more light in place of all this creeping dark. When she left you hours later, the meat pie long finished, your room smelled richer than it had in months. You sat there alone, candle burned down to a mere glow on the table, and pressed your hands to your belly, where, for the first time in days, there was something solid to hold on to. And you thought of the house on Haymarket, of warmth, of food, of the small, precious luxury of not having to choose each week between coal for the stove or bread for the table. That night you didn't sleep much, but when you rose at dawn to wash in water that still cracked your skin with cold, your mind was clearer than it had been in ages. A line had been drawn, softly, by a friend's gentle voice and the gift of hot pastry. And without fully meaning to, you found yourself already stepping across it.
The decision, when it finally came, didn't feel like a grand, trembling moment of fate. It was simpler, quieter, almost dull with inevitability. You packed your few belongings into the same worn bundle that had carried you to London in the first place, a shift or two, your comb, a small cloth-wrapped parcel of mended stockings, and the creased photograph of your mother that had begun to fade at the corners. You paid your landlady the last of your coins for the week's rent, ignoring her sour frown as she eyed your nearly empty purse, and stepped out into the gray sprawl of the city. The streets that morning were slick with old frost, turning the mud into something sticky and treacherous. You kept your eyes lowered, your steps careful, your breath rising in visible shivers. Even then, as your stomach twisted with what you were about to do, another part of you clung fiercely to the simple promise Jane had made. You would not go hungry tonight. It took longer than you thought to find the house. The address Jane had given you was tucked on a narrow side street off the Haymarket, wedged between a chemist's shop with dusty bottles in the window and a warehouse that smelled sharply of leather.
When you finally stood before the door, your heart knocked harder than your fist ever could. It was an unremarkable door, painted a fresh, polite blue, brass knocker polished to a modest shine. No sign declared what lay beyond it. That discretion was the first rule of this new life, one you already understood well enough. For a moment, you simply stood there. The street was busy behind you, carts rattling past, the calls of vendors ricocheting between buildings. Life continued, indifferent. With a small breath that felt like swallowing a stone, you lifted your hand and knocked. It was Betsy who answered, though you didn't yet know her name. A slight girl, younger even than you, with brown hair caught in a neat plait and a face that bore the serious weight of someone who'd already seen more than most would believe. Her eyes scanned you quickly, your thin shawl, your patched skirts, the hopeful dread written clear across your face. Then she stepped aside to let you pass. Inside, the air closed around you with a rush of warmth that made your eyes prickle. It smelled of coal smoke, yes, and the underlying musk of bodies, but also of roasted meat drifting faintly from somewhere deeper in the house, of soap that clung to freshly scrubbed floors, a smell of living, of people who expected to stay alive long enough to care how things smelled. That alone was nearly dizzying.
You followed Betsy down a dim hallway, your bundle clutched tight in both hands. The corridor stretched narrow and long, doors branching off on either side, each one closed, hiding its own secrets. A pair of voices drifted from somewhere ahead, low, amused, unmistakably female. Your mouth had gone dry, but there was no turning back now. Each step seemed to echo with its own quiet finality. At the end of the hall waited a small parlor, its walls hung with prints of calm country scenes that felt almost cruel in their quiet prettiness. The furniture was solid, draped here and there with shawls that suggested casual comfort. A clock ticked on the mantel, marking out the moments that now belonged, unmistakably, to this place. It was there you met Mrs. Cartwright. She rose from a cushioned chair by the hearth with a kind of deliberate grace, her dark gown sweeping the floor. Her hair was arranged neatly under a small cap, and though her expression was not exactly soft, it wasn't harsh either. Her eyes, sharp, assessing, pale as mist, took in every detail of you in a single glance. "Mary, is it?" she said, though you hadn't yet offered your name. Or perhaps it was simply the one Jane had left for you. "I run a respectable house here. You'll find order, routine, and expectations to match. Keep yourself clean, do as instructed, and you'll be fed and paid fairly. Cross me, and you'll be out on the street before nightfall. Are we clear?" Your tongue felt thick, but you managed a breathless, "Yes, ma'am." That seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, a brief flick of approval, then gestured to Betsy. "Show her the room. Lily can help her settle." The bedroom was on the upper floor, tucked beneath the slant of the roof. The wallpaper was a faded riot of tiny flowers, peeling slightly near the window where damp had stained it dark. Two narrow beds stood against opposite walls, each with its own small chest and washstand. A thin line of steam curled from a teapot on the table between them, and the air carried a hint of lavender, trying its best to crowd out older, less pleasant scents. The girl who must be Lily was perched cross-legged on one bed, mending a hem. She looked up as you entered, a grin breaking over her face that was half relief, half mischief. "No one?" asked Betsy, who simply nodded before disappearing back down the stairs. Lily's eyes darted back to you, bright and curious. "Well, don't just stand there freezing. Come in, set your things down. I promise I won't bite."
It was clumsy, your first awkward setting down of your bundle on the chest, your careful smoothing of your skirts. Your hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. Lily watched you with the easy familiarity of someone long past caring about first impressions. Where'd you come from, then? Country girl, by the look. Most of us were. I was from Manchester, worked a loom till the noise near deafened me. You managed a small laugh, the first sound from your throat that didn't catch painfully. Outside Bath, you said. Farm, then sewing here. Didn't pay enough to keep me fed. Aye, that's how it goes, Lily said. Her needle flashed through the cloth, quick and sure. But you'll find your feet. This place ain't the worst by half. We eat regular, fires stay lit, doctor comes every week. Madam runs a tight ship. Could be worse, could be out there. Her chin tilted toward the window, where, beyond the dim glass, the street stretched on, crowded with strangers. You sat on the edge of your bed for as long as you managed to last here, and tried to breathe through the swirl of scents and fears and small, unexpected comforts. Lily talked on, filling the space with chatter about which customers tipped best, who snored, who liked to boast of politics they didn't understand. Her voice wound around you like a thread, steadying, ordinary, in a way that felt like the first warm hand you'd grasped in too long. When night fell proper, it brought with it muted laughter and footsteps on the stairs, doors opening and closing. The parlor below filled with voices pitched low, the clink of glass on glass. You sat by the small cracked mirror, hands trembling slightly as you tried to pin your hair up neatly. Lily came behind you, deftly twisting a stray lock into place, her fingers gentle. There now, she murmured, you look just fine, better than most when they first land here. Remember, you ain't selling yourself, not really. You're selling a story, a little dream. Give it to them, take their coin, and keep what's yours safe inside. It struck you then how strange it was to find kindness here, in the very place you'd feared most. But as you drew a slow breath, smoothing the front of your borrowed dress, you realized it was exactly that softness, threaded quietly through the hard lines of survival, that might let you keep standing. The house stirred around you, its old bones creaking, carrying laughter and secrets up through the floorboards. And you knew, in a way deeper than thought, that your life had already stepped over a threshold long before you ever crossed this one.
That first evening passed in a blur of new sights and hushed instructions, your senses half numb from exhaustion and nerves. But it was the morning after, when the house settled into its quieter rhythm and the night's visitors were gone, that you began to truly see the other women who lived within these walls. You sat on the edge of your bed, feet dangling just above the floorboards, trying to comb out the stubborn tangles in your hair. Lily lounged across from you on her own narrow mattress, propped up on one elbow, humming something low and tuneless. Her copper hair spilled over her shoulder in a thick braid that gleamed even in the dim light. "You keep fussing like that, you'll have your scalp raw," she teased, her mouth quirking into a grin. I let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh. Can't go down looking like I fought a thorn bush. That'd almost be a novelty here. Lily stretched luxuriously, arching her back until her joints gave a little pop. Most men wouldn't mind. Half of them don't see past their own collars anyway. Her voice carried a slight off-balance quality that you hadn't noticed at first. When she turned her head to glance out the window, you realized she had a habit of favoring her right side, tilting toward sounds. You found your curiosity slipping out before you could stop it. Was it always like that, your hearing?" She paused, her smile fading to something more thoughtful. "No, that's a gift of the mill. Started at 11. Looms were louder than cannon fire, or so my dad used to say. I worked next to a girl who stuffed wads of cotton in her ears. Got a beating for waste when they caught her. I didn't bother. thought I was clever, thought I could tough it out. I tapped the side of my head lightly. Now I miss half of what's said if it's behind me. But here, well, most gents talk so loud or drunk it doesn't matter much.
She didn't say it bitterly, just plain, like you might remark on the weather or the way bread sometimes went moldy faster in summer. You felt a faint pang all the same. It seemed each girl in this house carried something invisible with her, small losses, unspoken aches, smoothed over by practice, but never entirely gone. Later that day, you found yourself in the kitchen where the warmth of the stove drew everyone eventually. Emily was there, a petite blonde with quick hands who often helped cook prepare trays for the parlor. She spoke of growing up on a dairy farm in Devon, her hands shaping the memory of calves wobbling on too thin legs. "I used to think I'd marry a cooper's boy," she said with a shrug, pressing her palms flat to the scarred table as though grounding herself. "But his family moved on, and ours couldn't keep the land, so here I am. Least I'm not bent over cow muck every morning." Sarah sat across from her, older than the rest of you by nearly a decade. She was rolling up accounts for Mrs. Cartwright, fingers stained faintly with ink. Her sharp, clever eyes missed nothing. "You'd be surprised," she said dryly. "There's muck of a different sort here, just better hidden by velvet curtains." Emily laughed, unbothered. "Still smells sweeter than the cowshed." Then there was Josephine, newest after you, delicate as a frost lace window pane. Her story was quiet, parceled out in hesitant confessions during late evenings when the two of you washed at the cracked basin. Her father had been a clerk who lost his position when debts tangled around him tighter than his ledgers. The family splintered, mother taken in by distant cousins, brothers shipped off as cabin boys. Josephine had tried keeping house for an elderly aunt who eventually decided she couldn't afford the extra mouth. And so she'd arrived here, trembling at every shadow, her hands always fluttering near her throat as though expecting some new indignity. But more than their pasts, it was their small future dreams that tangled around your heart. One afternoon, as you polished the glasses behind the small bar in the parlor, Lily came by with a cloth draped over her shoulder. She leaned her elbows on the counter, watching you with that half-smile of hers. "I ever tell you about the sea?" she asked, almost as if continuing a conversation you hadn't started. "Can't say you have." She tilted her head back, eyes going soft. "When I was a little thing, my uncle took me down to Brighton, just for a day. I remember standing there on the shingle, waves crashing so loud it rattled my chest. Salt in the air, wind pulling my hair every which way. It smelled huge, bigger than anything. And the sky, it was like nothing could hold it down." She paused, drawing a slow breath. "Someday, I want to go back, rent a little room near the water, wake up to gulls instead of cab wheels." Emily, who'd drifted over with a tray of glasses, gave a wistful little sigh. "I'd like that too. Or maybe Cornwall. They say the cliffs there drop right into the blue, as far from London smoke as you can get." Even Sarah, who usually scoffed at such talk, murmured, "I wouldn't mind seeing it once more, just to remember the world's bigger than these streets." And Josephine, overhearing from the corner, hugged her elbows. "I'd stand barefoot where the waves wash in. Let them pull the dust off me. Feels like it's soaked into my skin, this city." Their voices wove around you, bright threads against the dim rooms, stitching dreams you hadn't dared piece together yourself. You found you could see it too, some tiny cottage perched above a rocky cove, windows open to salted wind, your lungs filled with something cleaner than London's choke. Even if it never came to be, the sharing of it mattered. It was a fragile promise passed hand to hand, one more thing this house held besides transactions and rules. So when night crept on again, bringing with it the clink of coin in Mrs. Cartwright's ledgers and footsteps of men climbing the stairs, you didn't feel quite as hollow. Each of you carried private aches and distant shorelines in your minds, tucked safe behind practiced smiles. And that, you realized, was its own kind of mercy. In a house built on illusions sold nightly, these small secret hopes were the only truths that truly belonged to you. Mornings in the house began with a hush that was almost tender. It came after the long hours of laughter and clinking glasses, after the doors had closed behind the last departing gentleman, and the echo of boots on the stair had faded into quiet. Then the place seemed to breathe out, settling into a gentler rhythm, as if the walls themselves relaxed.
You woke slowly, blinking against the first cold light slipping through the thin curtains. The room always felt colder then, the embers in the grate long since gone to gray ash. Lily usually stirred before you, yawning and stretching like a cat, her hair a tumble of copper across the pillow. She'd sit up and rub her ear, always the right one, a small unconscious gesture tied to the partial deafness the mill had left her with. Then it was time for the first ritual of the day, the wash. You threw off the thin blanket, feeling the immediate bite of chill air on your bare arms, and padded over to the little table between your beds. The pitcher there often wore a delicate rime around its lip, tiny ice feathers that cracked when you poured water into the basin. The shock of it on your face was enough to make your breath hitch, eyes stinging, but it also cleared the sleep from your skull in a way nothing else could. You splashed it along your throat, down to your collarbone, trying to chase off the scent of sweat and old lavender water that clung after the long night. Beside you, Lily hissed as she dipped her own cloth. "Colder than a landlord's heart," she muttered, squeezing droplets from her lashes. But when she caught your eye in the cracked mirror propped on the stand, she gave a crooked grin, shaking her head so fine droplets flew like tiny diamonds. Once your skin was wiped clean and sharp with gooseflesh, you moved to the next trial, the corset. It waited on the back of the chair, looking deceptively harmless laid out flat. You'd learned quickly that lacing it was a skill all its own. Too loose, and it offered no shape. Too tight, and you'd be breathless before breakfast. Some mornings Lily helped you, tugging the laces and practiced pulls while you braced hands against the wall. The sensation was always the same, a tightening like someone hugging you from all sides, forcing your ribs in just enough to lift your bust and smooth your waist. When it was finished, you could feel each breath more consciously, chest rising against the constraint, belly held firm. "Not bad," Lily would say, fingers brushing down the stays to check the tension. "You'll pass muster. Turn about." You did, studying your reflection in the spotted glass. With the corset cinched, your shape transformed, softer curves smoothed into neat lines, shoulders pulled a touch straighter. It was all illusion, of course, just like the painted cheeks and scented wrists that would come later. But in this house, illusions kept bread on the table. You learned to appreciate the craft of it. Around you, the sounds of the morning began to bloom. Betsy's light footsteps padded down the hall, followed by Mrs. Winter's heavier tread, her voice low and steady as she rattled off instructions to the kitchen. The smell of bread starting to bake drifted up through the floorboards, warm and yeasty, making your stomach turn over with longing. While you smoothed your hair back from your forehead, pinning it into a modest knot for the day's chores, Lily leaned closer to the mirror to inspect her own reflection. She dabbed a finger under her eyes where faint shadows clung, then tilted her head this way and that. "Do you ever look and wonder if they'd even know us without all this?" she asked lightly, though her tone carried something quieter underneath. "Take away the stays, the pinned curls, the lavender, would we just vanish?" You considered that as you secured the last stubborn lock of hair. In the reflection, your faces hovered side by side, hers bright with freckles, yours a little paler, the two of you tied together by nothing but circumstance. Without the trappings, you realized, perhaps the world wouldn't bother seeing you at all. Instead of answering, you bumped your shoulder gently against hers, offering a small smile. Lily laughed, the sound bright enough to chase away whatever melancholy had started to gather. Ah well, better to vanish together, I suppose. Once your hair was done and your skirts smoothed, you pulled on your house dress, simple dark blue, sturdy enough for the work ahead, but still decent. You tied the apron at your waist, feeling how the corset beneath shaped even the fall of the plain cloth. Then it was time to step out into the hall, to follow the quiet current of the house toward the kitchen where warmth waited, where the day would truly begin. Each morning unfolded this way, a quiet ballet of washing, lacing, pinning, smoothing, small private preparations that steadied your mind as much as they ordered your appearance. It was in these shared moments at the mirror, with laughter or sighs drifting between you and Lily, that the work of becoming who you needed to be for the world truly started. By the time you left that small, chilly room, you were no longer just two tired girls from distant counties, but practiced performers stepping into the careful daylight of the house, corsets drawn tight around whatever softer truths you kept safely tucked inside.
It didn't take long to learn the rhythm of the house. Not when Mrs. Cartwright ran it with such precise purpose, every tick of her small brass clock seeming to echo down the halls like a command. Even on that very first morning, you felt the pattern settle around your shoulders as tangibly as your shawl. The day began early but without chaos. By the time you and Lily made your way downstairs, the household was already humming with controlled energy. Betsy darted through the passageways on silent feet, arms full of linens or kindling, her neat braids swinging. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, orchestrated the morning tasks with a kind of gruff affection that left no room for dawdling. Her sharp eyes noticed every speck of dust on the wainscoting, every smudge on a window pane, and she expected each of the girls to help keep things spotless. It was part of Mrs. Cartwright's philosophy, this insistence on cleanliness and order. Other houses, you'd heard in whispers over the dinner table, might allow the carpets to go threadbare and the parlors to smell of stale pipe smoke, letting their girls lounge idle until the next knock at the door. But not here. Here the brass handles were kept polished. The hallways aired each morning with windows flung wide, despite the London chill. And the scent that met guests was always a careful blend of fresh bread, coal smoke, and faint lavender. Never the heavy cloy of unwashed bodies. Breakfast came once the downstairs rooms were swept and dusted. You sat at the long wooden kitchen table alongside the other girls, Betsy bustling in and out with dishes while Cook clattered at the stove. The fare was simple but solid. Porridge thick with milk, a bit of jam on the better days, coarse bread still warm enough to melt the smear of dripping. A pot of coffee, real and strong, was always set in the center. Its aroma alone enough to wake you further. Mrs. Cartwright believed that well-fed girls brought in more custom, not just for the curve it lent to their cheeks, but because there was a glow to health that no rouge could convincingly imitate.
Mornings, after breakfast, were dedicated to maintaining the illusion of a refined home. Each girl had her own duties, polishing glasses in the small bar, straightening the plush cushions in the front parlor, dusting delicate figurines on the mantel. You found a quiet pleasure in these small tasks. There was a meditative quality to watching the wood shine under your cloth, to lining up each glass just so. It made the hours slip by gently, giving your hands purpose without demanding too much of your thoughts. By midday, the house slowed into a lull. Mrs. Cartwright would retreat to her private sitting room to go over accounts, often with Sarah's neat handwriting assisting, while Mrs. Winters oversaw Betsy in the scullery. The rest of you could take a moment to breathe, reading a borrowed novel, mending a tear in a hem, even dozing lightly if the night before had been long. Sometimes you and Lily sat near the kitchen hearth, sharing quiet stories or simply enjoying the warmth on your stockinged feet. Afternoons brought the first clients. These were usually discreet, harried men with lunch breaks stretched thin by desire. They favored short visits and quieter encounters, and often left as quickly as they arrived, smoothing their hair in the hallway mirror before hurrying back to whatever office awaited them. The house kept this period subdued. No bright laughter carried from the parlor, no loud songs were ever permitted. It was a time for discretion, for gentle conversation and modest charms. Dinner was served earlier than most households, around 5, to make way for the real business of the evening. Once again, you all gathered at the table. The meals were hearty, a stew rich with barley and carrots, thick slices of bread, sometimes a simple pudding studded with raisins. Wine appeared too, poured modestly by Mrs. Winters, enough to bring a flush to the cheeks and loosen any lingering stiffness from the day. As dusk settled outside, lamps were lit throughout the house. The scent of beeswax mingled with the ever-present coal smoke, and the quiet preparation began. Upstairs, you changed into dresses of finer cut and softer fabric, your hair pinned up more artfully, a whisper of scent dabbed at your wrists and behind your ears. Downstairs, Mrs. Cartwright checked that every room was in order. Her sharp eyes ensured no cushion sat crooked, no glass bore a smudge. It mattered deeply to her that the house never looked like a common establishment. Respectability was a fragile currency here, one she guarded with relentless care. When the evening truly began, it did so with a kind of hushed grandeur. Gentlemen were welcomed in the front parlor, offered a choice of sherry or brandy by Mrs. Winters, who could judge precisely how much conversation each man wanted before business was quietly arranged. Some stayed for hours, weaving delicate lies about loneliness and admiration that you learned to play along with. Others conducted their affairs briskly, barely lingering beyond the time needed. But through it all, the same rules held firm: clean linens on every bed, hot water ready after each visitor, no overindulgence that would leave a girl too worn for the next client. Mrs. Cartwright checked each account herself, ensuring fair division and setting aside money for small household comforts: fresh loaves from the baker each morning, extra coal for the hearth, a jar of preserves now and then to brighten breakfast. It was these small details that made her house different, that let you and the others laugh together at supper, dream a little of seaside cottages, even dare to imagine you might last here longer than most. So the days folded into each other, neatly hemmed by routine and the quiet authority of Mrs. Cartwright's watchful eye. And in that steady pattern, you found an unexpected sort of refuge. The work was still what it was, the clients still men who came for illusions, but the house itself, clean, warm, fed, wrapped around you like a second, sterner skin, guarding your more tender parts from the city that waited cold and indifferent just beyond the freshly painted door. It was in the evenings, most of all, that the true line between what was real and what was carefully spun from air seemed to waver. You felt it each time you stood before the old mirror in your shared room, watching your reflection slowly transform under your own hands. It was a delicate alchemy, one that required no spells beyond rouge, powder, and scent, yet it was just as powerful, reshaping not only how others saw you, but how you saw yourself. After the quiet rituals of the day, the sweeping, the polishing, the steady hours of patient waiting, there came this small fever of preparation. You started by loosening the simpler pins that held your hair through daylight's chores. It fell in soft waves down your back, carrying the faint memory of lavender water from your morning wash. Lily would sometimes stand behind you then, deft fingers twisting and coaxing the strands into an arrangement that looked careless but had taken years of small practice. A single ribbon, chosen to match your evening dress, tied the look together. When you tilted your head in the glass, you could almost believe it was someone else looking back, someone unburdened by too many hungry nights or silent tears into a thin pillow.
Then came the powder. You dabbed it along your cheekbones, your forehead, your chin, learning how to use just enough to smooth away the tired hollows without looking like a ghost under lamplight. Rouge followed, a careful touch on the apples of your cheeks, a faint press on your lips that made them seem fuller, more ready to smile. A stranger might think it frivolous, even brazen, but you knew it was armor, as crucial as the stays that shaped your waist. Without it, you felt exposed, your true weariness too naked to be admired. The dresses helped complete the deception. By candlelight, fine cloth took on a life of its own. The soft sheen of satin, the way a ribbon curved around your shoulder, could distract from almost anything. Even the older gowns, carefully brushed and mended by Betsy's neat hands, became something magical when the lamps burned low. They rustled when you moved, whispering promises that belonged to stories, not to hungry girls from country farms or factory floors. And then finally, scent. A tiny bottle waited on the table, its glass cut to catch the light. You touched a drop behind each ear, another at your wrists, feeling the cool slide of it on your skin. It smelled of sweet violets layered over something warmer, almost like sun-baked wood. When you closed your eyes and breathed it in, the drafty room fell away for just a moment. You were somewhere else. A green lawn, perhaps, bright under summer sky, with laughter floating across it instead of the cautious hush of girls dressing for men they might never see again. Downstairs, the transformation carried on. The house itself seemed to change once the lamps were lit. The worn carpets took on a new depth in the soft glow. The brass fixtures winked with sly promise. Even the air shifted, thickening with the scent of candles, wine, and the faint tang of pipe smoke. It was a place made for stories, the kind men brought with them on their lips and expected you to play a part in. It wasn't all lies, not exactly. You learned quickly how to become a version of yourself that suited whatever dream walked through the door. For some, you were gentle laughter and downcast eyes, a little shy about accepting a glass of sherry. For others, you were quick to tease, leaning in close so your breath warmed their cheek, letting them believe in a familiarity that never really touched your guarded heart. Each powder-dusted smile, each playful turn of phrase, wove another strand into the evening's delicate web.
And beneath it all, there was still you. The heartbeat that picked up when coins clinked on the side table. The small flutter of relief that tonight, at least, there would be enough to eat. You could almost believe the performance yourself, caught up in the music that drifted from the parlor, the polite murmur of voices, the clink of crystal. For a while, the reality of cracked wash basins and unpaid debts softened at the edges. But later, when you returned to your small upstairs room, you would set down the borrowed earrings, unlace the gown that smelled faintly of stranger's cologne, and watch as the rouge and powder washed away under a cloth dipped in cold water. Bit by bit, the illusion faded, leaving only your own face staring back, pale, tired, still faintly fragrant, but undeniably yours. That was the finest line of all, learning to step back across it each night, to gather up the scattered pieces of your true self before sleep claimed you. Because in this house, the masquerade was not just for the men who paid to sip at carefully offered dreams. It was also for you, to keep the days bearable, to guard the tender hope that maybe, just maybe, One day you might get to wear pretty things, scent your wrists, and smile into candlelight, not for survival, but simply because the night was yours to enjoy. It was nearly a week after you arrived that Mrs. Winters appeared at your shoulder one quiet morning, her ledger in one hand and her eyes sharp beneath her starched cap. She rapped the edge of the book lightly against her palm and murmured, "Doctor will see you today. Come along now, best not to dawdle." You'd heard of these examinations almost from the first hour you stepped through the blue door. Lily had whispered about them that night as you both lay in your narrow beds, her voice low so it wouldn't carry through the thin walls. Happens every fortnight, sometimes sooner if someone's taken poorly. Madam's particular about her reputation. Says nothing ruins a house faster than a whiff of sickness. At the time, you'd nodded, trying to seem unfazed, though inside your stomach had twisted hard. Now, as you followed Mrs. Winters down the hall, past the neatly dusted lamps and the polished banister, that same uneasy knot returned. It was different from the first night's tremors, from the frightened thrill of your new work. This was smaller, colder, like a tiny shard of ice lodged just beneath your ribs.
The doctor waited in the small front parlor, his black bag resting on the low table. He was not an old man exactly, but wore the air of someone who had long since learned to look through people rather than at them. His spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, catching the light so you couldn't quite see his eyes. As you entered, he glanced up, then down again to the neat sheet of paper Mrs. Cartwright had given him, listing the names of every girl in the house. Mrs. Winters nodded to you. "This is Mary. New since last Tuesday." "Of course." The doctor's voice was clipped, already impatient. He gestured you closer with a flick of his fingers. "Come stand by the window. Better light." The examination was swift, but thorough in ways that made your skin prickle. He pressed cool fingertips to your throat, listened at your back with a small polished horn while he told you to breathe deeply, checked your wrists, the inside of your elbows, lifted your chin to peer at your eyes. Then he set aside his instruments and pulled on a pair of thin gloves, the snap of the cuffs sounding far too loud in the still room. He said you would undress to the waist, not unkindly, but with no softness either. It was rote to him, a transaction of skin and breath and quick observations. You obeyed, your hands fumbling slightly at the ties of your bodice. When it loosened, the cold air closed in instantly, making gooseflesh dance along your shoulders. He examined you in silence, lifting your arms one at a time, pressing here and there, checking for small swellings you didn't want to think about. Once his breath caught just faintly, as if he'd found something unexpected, and your heart leapt painfully, but he only shifted his hand and moved on. At last he stepped back, nodding curtly. "You may dress." You fumbled the fabric back into place, your fingers stiff. Mrs. Winters, who had stood by the whole time like a silent sentinel, gave a small approving grunt when you'd finished. "All right then, back to your duties." As you slipped out of the room, you caught a glimpse of the doctor making a neat note beside your name. That tiny tick of ink seemed to echo louder than any spoken word.
Later that afternoon, in the quiet of your room, you found yourself rubbing absently at your throat where his fingers had pressed. Lily sat by the window, stitching a torn cuff. When she looked over and caught your expression, her own softened. "First time's always the worst," she said. "You think he's found something, spots on your lungs, swelling where it oughtn't be, even if he hasn't said so. "Do they ever find it?" you asked, your voice very small. "Oh, sometimes," Lily admitted, nodding her thread. "There was a girl last month, sweet thing, called Annie, coughed too much for too long. Cartwright packed her off to a clinic before the gentleman could start whispering. Better than the street, but—" She left the thought unfinished, only shrugged. "And there was Clara before her, but that was different. Caught something nasty from a visitor. They sent her to the infirmary over in Whitechapel. Not seen her back since." A hush fell between you, broken only by the faint scrape of Lily's needle. Outside, a cart rolled by, wheels crunching over gravel, and somewhere a vendor shouted about oysters. The world carried on, indifferent to the small tremors inside the house. You realized then that the rules here were not just about neat parlors and polished glasses. They were about maintaining an unspoken promise to every man who crossed the threshold, that nothing dangerous lurked behind the soft smiles and scented wrists, that this was a place of comfort, not of consequences. Mrs. Cartwright's clean linens and daily wash basins were only part of the illusion. The doctor's visits stitched the rest together, stark insurance against the whispers that could destroy a house like hers overnight. That night, as you readied yourself at the cracked mirror, smoothing powder over your cheeks and pinning your hair into careful curls, you caught your own eye in the glass. You thought of the doctor's gloved hands, the way they had prodded so impersonally, cataloging you like livestock. And yet, here you still were, painted, perfumed, corseted into shape, the delicate boundary between health and something darker hidden beneath satin and lace.
It struck you then how very fine that boundary was, how any one of you might slip across it without realizing until it was too late. But you pushed the thought aside, the way all of you learned to do, because there was laughter already rising from the parlor below and footsteps on the stairs, and when survival was balanced so carefully on appearances, there simply wasn't room for fear. By midday, the house settled into a curious kind of peace, the intense hush of night replaced by the industrious calm of honest work. If you had wandered through then, peeking past the polished doors and fresh draperies, you might almost have mistaken it for any respectable household, one busy with its own gentle errands and small duties. You often found yourself in the hallway, dustcloth in hand, polishing the wooden panels that lined the narrow corridor. The grain warmed under your touch, the faint scent of beeswax rising each time you drew the cloth along in long, patient strokes. Lily usually worked nearby, fussing over the small tables that stood under oval mirrors, rearranging vases of modest flowers Mrs. Cartwright insisted upon. Their petals brightened the house, small splashes of cream or soft pink that reminded you, painfully sometimes, of hedgerows in bloom back home. From the kitchen drifted more comforting smells than any perfume you dabbed behind your ears at night. There was always bread. The loaves started early, their yeasty promise growing stronger by the hour until your mouth watered just passing the door. Cook liked to keep the stove going even when she didn't strictly need it, feeding it small handfuls of kindling so the room stayed welcoming. The mingled fragrances of warm wood, coal smoke, and rising dough seemed to wrap the whole lower floor in a homely shawl. Most days, Betsy dashed between kitchen and scullery, skirts fluttering, carrying baskets of peelings out to the alley or hauling back kindling from the stack. She managed it all with a competence you envied, her face pink from the heat, stray curls sticking to her damp forehead, always humming some tune under her breath that made the work feel lighter just to hear it. You helped where needed, wiping down the little bar counter, sweeping stray crumbs from under the dining table, or fetching extra plates when the stack by the dresser ran low. It was menial, yes, but strangely grounding. Each task completed was a small bit of order claimed back from the wide, unpredictable world. You came to treasure that sense of simple cause and effect. Wipe here, shine there, and see something improve beneath your hands. Mrs. Cartwright, for her part, moved through all of this like a quiet, watchful shadow. She seldom raised her voice, but the tilt of her chin or the slight narrowing of her eyes was enough to set anyone straight. By noon, she usually retired to the small office off the hall, where ledgers lay open beside a delicate vase of violets. But today she emerged clutching a letter, her brow drawn into thoughtful lines that made you pause where you stood. She caught sight of you and Lily both, dusting near the front window. "Girls," she said, tone clipped but not unkind. "Message from Mr. Harwood's steward. He'll be sending guests tomorrow evening. See that we have extra brandy and that the upstairs sitting room is aired properly." Lily offered a quick nod, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. "Of course, madam." As Mrs. Cartwright moved on, the faint rustle of paper still in her hand, Lily shot you a small grin. "That means tomorrow we'll be turning out rugs and beating dust till our arms drop off." You made a mock grimace, though inside there was a curious flutter, half dread, half relief. Busy days kept your mind occupied, left less room for the sharp little fears that sometimes crept in when your hands were still. And besides, there was pride, too, in seeing the house set to its best. When guests arrived in their polished boots and carefully tied cravats, they found a place that gleamed under the lamplight, smelled of warm bread and clean linen, and offered laughter that sounded, if only briefly, like something close to joy. Come afternoon, cook would often take pity on whoever happened to pass through the kitchen. "Go on, take a heel of this," she'd say, carving a slice from the newest loaf still steaming on the board. You'd cradle it in your palms, breathing in the rich, homely scent before daring a bite. It nearly melted on your tongue, salty butter soaking into the soft crumb. For a few moments, standing there by the stove with Lily, laughing at something Betsy had said, you could forget entirely the reason the house needed to be so clean, so inviting. In those hours, wiping down the brass doorknobs, carrying fresh water up the stairs, brushing crumbs from the folds of your apron, you lived a life not so different from countless other women across the city. The tasks were humble, familiar, tied to hearth and hand. It was only later, when the lamps were lit and the gentlemen began to arrive with eager eyes and coin in hand, that the careful illusion cracked open again. But until then, you allowed yourself to lean into the ordinary, drawing quiet strength from the scent of baking bread, the gentle clatter of plates, and the low murmur of voices that belonged, if only for a little while, to something almost like a home.
It was nearing dusk when Mrs. Winters found you in the hallway, wiping down the baseboards with a damp cloth that had gone cold long ago. Her shadow fell across the floorboards before her voice did, low and level as always. "Mary, you're wanted in the small parlor. Mr. Wilson's arrived and asked to see someone new." Your heart gave a small, traitorous jump. You pressed the cloth hard into your palm for a moment to steady yourself, then rose, smoothing your skirts. The evening lamps had just been lit, sending their soft golden pools spilling across the carpet, catching at the tiny glass beads sewn into your bodice. You felt them under your fingertips as you straightened your neckline, a faint, prickly texture, almost like a reminder of what was expected. The small parlor was warmed by a lively fire, its flames snapping and throwing dancing shadows along the walls. The scent of beeswax and fresh pine kindling curled together in the air, edged by something sharper, the faint peppery note of the sherry decanter waiting on the sideboard. Mr. Wilson stood near the mantel, inspecting one of the delicate figurines Mrs. Cartwright kept there, his gloved hand turning it gently back and forth. He was neatly dressed, his coat a deep claret that set off the pale of his carefully knotted cravat, dark hair combed with a precise side part. When he heard the door open, he set the figure down and turned to you with a practiced, mild smile. "Ah, you must be Mary." His voice was pleasant, measured, polite in a way that didn't grate. That small courtesy was a mercy you hadn't expected. You dipped into a slight curtsy, feeling the unfamiliar tug of your gown's bodice where Lily had pinned it tighter earlier. "Good evening, sir." He gestured lightly toward the little settee near the hearth. "Please, do sit. I find it dreadfully awkward to stand about like two strangers waiting for a stagecoach." That startled a small laugh out of you, uncertain but genuine. You crossed the rug and lowered yourself onto the settee, careful to keep your hands folded in your lap. Mr. Wilson poured a measure of sherry into 2 cut crystal glasses, then offered one to you. As your fingers closed around it, the cool, weighty glass seemed almost absurd. Fragile luxury that felt foreign against your still rough hands.
"A new acquaintance," he said, with a slight lift of his glass. You mirrored him, the rim touching your lips, and let the sherry slide across your tongue. It was sweeter than you expected, with a faint burn that settled warm in your chest. For a few quiet breaths, it drove off the cold that had been lodged beneath your ribs since you first stepped into the house. Mr. Wilson seated himself across from you, one ankle crossing over his knee. "Mrs. Cartwright tells me you're recently arrived. I imagine London has been rather overwhelming. It's large, sir, and loud." The truth slipped out before you could dress it in softer edges. Then you colored, quickly adding, "But there's much opportunity here, more than back home." He smiled faintly, as though amused by your earnest scramble. "Indeed. And your family is from the country?" "Yes, near Bath." You curled your fingers slightly around the stem of the glass, steadying yourself with the small anchor of it. He regarded you over the rim of his glass for a moment, his gaze neither hungry nor cruel, simply weighing. "You've a softness yet that's very charming. I hope London doesn't take it from you too quickly." Something in your chest tightened at that, not pain exactly, but a tender bruise pressed by an unexpected hand. You offered a careful smile. "I'll try to hold on to it, sir." For a while you simply talked, about small things, the weather's stubborn chill, how the city's fog could swallow entire streets, the quality of the wine. He asked questions that were polite rather than probing, as if content just to hear your voice. When you laughed once, more freely than you meant to, his smile reached his eyes, and for a fleeting instant it felt very nearly real, this gentle conversation by the fire. Eventually, he set his glass down, reached to take your hand lightly in his. His thumb brushed over your knuckles in a way that sent a faint shiver up your arm, though you couldn't have said if it was entirely unpleasant or simply unfamiliar. "Shall we go upstairs?" he asked softly, almost apologetically, as though embarrassed by the inevitable shape of the evening.
Your throat felt tight, but you nodded. This was why he'd come, after all. The warmth of the sherry lingered, smoothing the edges of your fear. As he rose and offered his arm, you took it, letting the illusion stretch just a heartbeat longer, that you were simply 2 people seeking each other out on a cold night, drawn by something kinder than coin. In the quiet hallway beyond, the house seemed to hold its breath around you. For that small walk to the stair, his arm linked with yours, you allowed yourself to lean into the fantasy, that his gentle courtesy might mean something deeper, that his careful attention was not merely rented by the hour. And when the door finally closed behind you upstairs, the firelight still flickering in memory, it was that fragile warmth you clutched hardest, trying to keep the illusion alive just a moment longer before it too dissolved into the simple work of survival. When he left, the room seemed to expand in his absence, filling again with its own stillness. The air that had been close with breath and soft words now felt curiously flat, stripped of the weight of his body and his careful hands.
You sat on the edge of the bed for a moment longer, your skirt falling in quiet folds over your knees, the fabric still warm where you had lain. It was always like this, a hush that pressed close once the door clicked shut behind them, too intimate in its silence. You exhaled slowly, feeling your shoulders loosen as though some subtle brace inside had finally been removed. Relief came first, an honest sort that unclenched something low in your belly. The work was done, for now. You were safe again inside your own skin, free to breathe without measuring every motion for someone else's pleasure. Then, almost as quickly, came the faint wash of something else. Not quite sorrow. It didn't have enough weight to drag on your ribs, but a kind of hollow echo. An emptiness where just minutes ago there had been the soft press of another's hand, the murmur of small lies meant to soothe or sweeten. Even when the clients were gentle, even when their touches were careful, there was always this parting vacuum, like stepping off a stair you thought was there and finding only air beneath your foot. You moved by quiet habit. There was the sheet to strip first, rolling it into itself so you didn't have to see the faint impress of where you'd both been. The fresh linen from the basket by the door was cool and faintly scented with lye, clean in a way that seemed almost sharp after the muddled warmth of the bed. You spread it out, smoothing your palms over the coarse weave, pushing away any last trace of what had happened there. It was a small ritual that meant more than mere tidiness. Each sweep of your hands was a gentle erasure, a way to reset the world back to something neutral, untouched. You caught sight of yourself in the small mirror above the washstand, hair loosened, cheeks still faintly colored. For a heartbeat, it was as if someone else stared back, someone whose secrets you couldn't quite read. You reached up and tucked a stray lock behind your ear, fingertips cool against your temple, then looked away. At the basin, you dipped the cloth into water that had gone tepid, wiping carefully along your throat, across your collarbones. It wasn't only about washing away sweat or scent. It was about reclaiming your own edges, reminding your skin whom it truly belonged to. With each pass of the damp cloth, you felt the quiet return of yourself, like a ghost easing back into its rightful bones. In the hallway beyond, you could hear muted voices, the faint clink of glasses being cleared from the parlor. Life in the house went on unbroken. Betsy would be carrying up fresh towels, Lily laughing low with Emily over some half-wicked joke, Mrs. Winters prowling the corridors to be sure everything remained in its orderly place. These sounds were strangely comforting, ordinary anchors that kept you from drifting too far into thought. You paused by the window, fingers resting on the sill. Outside, the street was washed in dim lamplight, figures moving through fog that blurred the edges of the world. Somewhere, someone laughed, bright, quick, fleeting, and the sound felt oddly hopeful. You found your breath matching its rhythm, a small hitch that lifted you back from the deeper ache. Then you turned from the window, tugged the bed cover neatly into place, and smoothed your skirts. Whatever softness or sorrow had brushed at your ribs was folded away with the wrinkled sheet, stowed in the quiet corners of your mind. The room was ready again, clean and waiting, and so were you, or close enough to pass for it. Because this was the true skill you learned here, more than any art of laughter or caress: how to leave pieces of yourself tucked safe inside, untouched by hands or coin, so that when the door opened again, you could still greet whoever stepped through it with a composed, steady heart.
The kitchen was the true heart of the house, not the parlor with its velvet cushions and delicate glasses, not the bedrooms with their carefully laundered sheets, but this warm, bustling space thick with the scents of coal and bread and roasted onions. It was here that the girls gathered in quieter hours, drawn by the steady heat of the stove and the promise of a cup of tea that hadn't yet gone bitter on the leaves.
You slipped into your usual spot near the worn table, feeling your shoulders ease almost without conscious thought. The long day's small tensions always seemed to soften here. Lily perched across from you, one foot tucked up under her, her sewing laid aside for now. Emily leaned against the sideboard, peeling apples into neat curls that fell into her apron. Even Betsy, breathless from ferrying fresh linens upstairs, paused to rest her elbows on the table's scarred surface. The talk, as always, turned easily to the house's lifeblood, the clients. But here, beyond their reach, stripped of polite pretense and paid-for smiles, the men were reduced to something smaller, almost harmless, softened by the playful cruelty of memory. "Did you hear about Mr. Bramley last night?" Emily began, her knife flashing in the dim light. "Fell asleep right there on top of the counterpane, snoring like a sawmill. Poor Joe tried to wake him, but he just mumbled about a meeting with the mayor and rolled over." "Better sleep than pawing at you all night," Lily said dryly. Then her lips quirked into a sly grin. "Though less generous with the tips, I suppose." "That's no lie," Emily agreed, dropping another ribbon of apple peel into her apron. She had to jingle his purse herself to find her payment. Swore she left him a whole shilling lighter than he'd planned. A ripple of laughter ran around the table, low and warm. Even Betsy giggled behind her hand, though she quickly sobered when the oven door clanged shut behind Cook. "And what about the banker?" you asked, finding your voice bolder here in this circle of familiar faces. "The one with the gold watch chain, who talks of Paris so grandly."
"Oh, him," Lily rolled her eyes heavenward. "Calls me my little nightingale, as if it's the first clever line that's ever crossed his lips. Last week he tried to sing a bit of opera himself. Sounded like a goat with its foot caught." This sent the whole lot of you into helpless laughter, Emily clutching her side, Betsy hiding her face against her sleeve. For a moment, the kitchen felt brighter, almost reckless with shared mirth. When the giggles died down, you noticed Josephine hovering near the door, half in shadow, a small smile playing at her lips. You crooked a finger at her. "Come on, Joe, what's yours? You've got that look like you're keeping the best one to yourself." She hesitated, then slipped forward to lean against the back of your chair. "Had a gentleman last week who insisted on reciting poetry, only he was drunk as 6 fiddlers and kept losing his place. Finally, he gave up and recited the Lord's Prayer instead, but with all the words jumbled. Called me Our Daily Heaven by mistake." Lily slapped her hand on the table. "Your daily heaven, that's rich. We ought to have it painted over the front door." Josephine flushed, laughing now, her eyes bright. The joke itself wasn't cruel, it was too absurd, too fond in its own mocking way. It was a way to trim these men down to size, to take back a bit of power after hours spent crafting sweet illusions for their coin. Each laugh, each eye roll, each outrageous story swapped across the table was a quiet stitch in the hidden quilt of your collective defenses. And beneath all the laughter ran something gentler, the constant, easy solidarity that lived in this kitchen. Betsy might toss her towel at Lily's head when she got too saucy. Emily might tease Josephine until she blushed deep pink. But if one of you returned from upstairs looking pale, with your dress rumpled and your hands shaking just faintly, there were no clever jabs. Only the pressing of a warm mug into your palms, a gentle hand rubbing your back. Lily's soft, "There now, love, breathe a bit." In these small conspiracies of humor, these playful scandals shared over apple peels and chipped teacups, you found something precious. The world outside might see only the shadow of what you were, might judge with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, but here in the glow of the stove, among girls who laughed and leaned close, you were simply yourselves, fragile, hopeful, wicked, kind. And that, more than the sherry or satin gowns or practiced smiles, was what kept you steady enough to face each new evening. It was on certain afternoons, rare and bright with unexpected time, that you ventured out beyond the polished threshold of the house and into the jostling pulse of the street.
Those small trips, though practical on their face, carried a kind of giddy, secret thrill. For a little while, you belonged not to dim hallways or private rooms, but to London itself, raw and uncontained. Today was one of those days. Mrs. Cartwright had pressed a small purse into your hand that morning, instructing you to fetch fresh ribbons for the parlor curtains and a bit more face powder from the shop on Vine Street. The errands were simple enough, but they also meant freedom, a chance to slip into the crowded lanes where you were no longer a girl from a particular house, but just another figure moving briskly beneath the city's sprawling gray canopy. You set off with Lily at your side, both of you wrapped tight in shawls against the bite of lingering cold. The street was alive with clangs and shouts, boys racing past with bundles of newspapers, carts stacked high with coal, a pair of flower sellers squabbling over who'd stolen whose spot. You drank it all in greedily, letting the noise and commotion fill up spaces inside you that too often felt thin and hollow. At the first stall, you stopped for a length of pale blue ribbon, the seller a stooped old man with a cheerful gap-toothed grin who tried to convince Lily she ought to take 2 yards more for her bonny hair. She laughed him off, but not unkindly, slipping a copper into his palm with a wink that left him chuckling to himself long after you'd walked on. A little further along, you paused before a cart draped with bright shawls, reds and greens vivid even in the weak light. Your own was starting to fray at the edges, threads catching whenever you pulled it tighter around your shoulders. After a bit of shy fingering of the piles, you found one in a soft, mossy green that seemed to set off the darker tones of your dress. The price made you hesitate, only to have Lily nudge your elbow, whispering, "Go on, love. Think how fine you'll look next time Mr. Wilson comes calling." That made your cheeks warm, though you couldn't help a laugh, and you gave in. The weight of the new shawl across your shoulders felt like more than just cloth. It was a small act of claiming something pretty for yourself, not only for the house's illusions.
You picked up a packet of sturdy brass pins next, to keep your hair from falling loose at inconvenient moments. The shop girl who sold them wore her curls in a tower that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense, and you and Lily spent the next block giggling over how many pins it must have swallowed to keep it standing. But best of all was the sweet stall on the corner. The woman behind it was stout and rosy, her apron dusted with sugar. Rows of little pastries sat in neat ranks, oozing jam from their seams. You spent perhaps longer than was sensible, deciding which to take, savoring the simple luxury of choice. In the end, you selected one with plum filling that stained your fingers a deep purple as you bit in. Lily chose cherry, the syrup bright as jewels on her lips. You walked on nibbling the flaky crusts, ignoring the cold that pinched your noses, delighting in how the syrup stuck just slightly in your teeth. "Feels wicked," Lily murmured through a mouthful. "Spending good coin on fripperies when there's stew enough back at the house. But then, we earn it," you finished for her, with a small, fierce nod. "Every last penny." She grinned, bumping her shoulder against yours. And it was true. You did. If anyone in London deserved a warm shawl or a little tart filled with summer fruit, it was the girls who traded soft laughter and patient hours for another's fleeting comfort. By the time you turned back toward home, arms full of neat parcels, you felt almost light. The streets, even with their grime and crush of strangers, seemed to glitter a bit under the weak afternoon sun. Here was a world that bustled on, heedless of quiet sorrows, alive with barking dogs, the clatter of drays, the sharp whistle of a boy chasing his own runaway cap. You were part of it again, if only for an hour, not an ornament waiting in a carefully staged room, but simply a young woman, laughing with a friend, biting into a tart that dripped syrup down your wrist. It was these small errands, these tiny reckless purchases that stitched your weeks together in brighter thread. When you later brushed the crumbs from your gloves and tucked the new shawl into your chest of drawers, you did it with a secret little smile. No matter how hard the nights might press, no matter the careful games you played under lamplight, the city still offered moments of sweetness, reminders that the world could be yours, if only for the length of a walk through its tangled streets. By the time you and Lily turned the last corner toward the house, the day had already begun its slow surrender to evening. The street lamps were being lit one by one, small islands of wavering gold that struggled against the gathering dusk. Your arms ached pleasantly from carrying your modest parcels, and the ghost of plum syrup still clung to your fingertips, a faint reminder of your small afternoon rebellion. The moment you stepped through the door, though, it was as if a different current seized hold of you, one that ran stronger and more insistent, pulling everything toward the hours ahead. The air inside seemed to vibrate with quiet urgency. It always did at this time, just before the first knock might come at the door, before the laughter and lowered voices began to ripple through the halls. The familiar warmth of the front hall closed around you, along with the subtle mix of scents that meant the house was readying itself. Beeswax polish, coal smoke rising fresh from the parlor hearths, and drifting up from the kitchen a rich promise of stew, thick with barley and onions. Your stomach gave a hopeful little turn at that. You'd been too giddy on the street to think much of hunger, but now it returned, all at once, practical and pressing. Mrs. Winters appeared from a side passage just as you were shrugging off your shawl. Her sharp eyes swept over you, taking in the faint flush on your cheeks, the telltale smudge of sugar at the edge of your mouth. "Been long enough," she said, not quite unkind, though the words were weighted by her usual cool scrutiny. "Madam expects everyone polished and ready. You'll want to hurry. It'll be busy tonight, mark my words." "Yes, ma'am," you murmured, lowering your gaze. You felt Lily nudge your side with her elbow, a tiny reassurance, before the two of you slipped past Mrs. Winters' stiff black skirts and started up the stairs. The corridor outside your shared room was a flurry of half-closed doors and hushed voices. Josephine passed you carrying a dress draped carefully over her arms, her eyes wide and bright in her pale face. Further along, Emily stood before a mirror pinned to the wall, pulling the last stubborn pins from her earlier hairstyle so she could twist it up anew for evening. Someone had set a little pot of lavender water on the stand, and its clean, almost sharp perfume floated on the air, battling faint undercurrents of powder and lingering sweat. Inside your room, you laid out your new shawl almost reverently on the chest at the foot of your bed. It seemed too lovely, too green and hopeful, to be tangled up in tonight's business just yet. So you chose instead the more subdued cream wrap that matched your evening gown, saving your little treasure for another, safer sort of outing. The process of dressing felt at once familiar and strangely weighty tonight, as though every motion carried extra consequence. You loosened your corset only to retighten it, wincing slightly as the stays pulled your waist in by another careful inch. The fabric of your gown slipped over your shoulders with a faint shush, cool against your freshly scrubbed skin. Lily stood behind you, deftly pinning up your hair, her hands gentle even as she twisted and coaxed each curl into place. "Feels like we're winding up a clock," you whispered with a weak little laugh. Lily smiled at your reflection in the cracked mirror, though her own eyes held a glint of nerves. "Aye, just don't let yourself tick too fast, or you'll wear out by midnight." Downstairs, the kitchen clamor had shifted into its own urgent melody. You heard Betsy's laughter ring out, quickly hushed by Cook's sharper voice, no doubt reminding her there was still bread to slice and dishes to set out. The scents deepened, a heartier note of roasting meat rising up through the floorboards. That was part of the ritual, too,
A good dinner laid out early so you'd all have strength for the long hours to follow. Mrs. Cartwright believed firmly that well-fed girls meant fewer fainting spells, fewer excuses to send a paying guest away empty-handed. Soon enough, you'd all gather at the big wooden table, skirts rustling, hair pinned high, cheeks faintly flushed from the heat of the stove. Mrs. Winters would stand at the end with her ledger in hand, ticking off small expenses and noting who needed new gloves or a fresh pot of rouge. Her eyes missed nothing, stray threads on a cuff, a faint bruise half hidden by lace, and her quiet, tight-lipped nod when satisfied was as close to praise as any of you hoped for.
Above it all hovered a sense of tightening expectation. As the sun finally fell beyond the rooftops, the house seemed to draw in a long, bracing breath. Lamps were lit, glasses polished to mirror brightness. Decanters of sherry and port arranged with military precision on the small bar in the parlor. You could almost feel the hush that followed, the way each girl's laughter softened, drifting into something lighter, watchful, waiting. It was nearly time. The knock would come soon, polite or eager or heavy with impatience. And then the delicate machinery of the evening would start its whirring, with each of you stepping into place like small jeweled cogs. For now, though, there was still the simple comfort of stew on your tongue, the warmth of Lily's shoulder brushing yours at the table, and the secret hope curled deep inside your chest that maybe tonight would pass gently, that maybe you'd find another small kindness to tuck away for darker hours. The hour before the house truly opened itself to the night had its own careful ceremony, as deliberate and necessary as any of the laces you pulled tight around your waist. It began with the table, long and sturdy, set at the back of the ground floor near the kitchen where the heat could still kiss your ankles beneath the skirts. Betsy laid out simple white cloths and placed bowls at each seat, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who knew exactly how little time there was to waste. You all gathered gradually, drifting in by twos and threes from upstairs rooms and narrow halls, voices pitched low in that shared, quiet anticipation. Lily settled beside you with a small sigh, smoothing her hands over the lap of her dress, though there was nothing out of place. Across the table, Emily laughed at something Josephine whispered in her ear, the two of them leaning so close their shoulders touched. Even Sarah had set aside her ever-present ledger, her ink-stained fingers tapping idly against the rim of her glass. At the head of the table sat Mrs. Cartwright, her posture impeccable, the crisp lines of her black gown unsoftened by the lamplight. Yet there was a kind of gravity in her presence that drew you all into an unspoken order, like iron filings aligning themselves around a magnet. Her eyes swept the table, noting who fidgeted, who avoided her gaze, who managed a composed little smile. "Eat well, girls," she said, her voice firm but not without a flicker of warmth. "Harwood's guests are never few, and where they come, others tend to follow. I'll not have anyone fainting on the stairs or looking peaked for lack of supper." Cook appeared then, bearing a great steaming pot of stew that smelled richly of beef and herbs, with thick slices of bread to catch every drop. Betsy followed with a pitcher of watered wine, pouring careful measures into each chipped goblet until a soft red glow circled the table. You dipped your spoon into the hearty broth, feeling the comforting heat slide down into the hollow of your belly. Around you, the usual gentle chatter began to stir. Emily recounting how a young lad in the market had tried to press a sprig of rosemary into her hand. Lily making a wry face as she described a ribbon seller's unwelcome wink.
Even Josephine giggled over a mishap with her hairpins earlier that nearly left her coiffure tumbling down her back. Mrs. Cartwright listened, her eyes narrowing slightly at some of the more daring bits, but she did not interrupt. Only once the bowls were mostly empty did she lean forward, folding her hands together in a small, commanding steeple. "Remember what this house stands for," she said, her voice dropping into the low, measured cadence you'd come to recognize as her most serious. "There are places all over this city where men pay for squalor, for sour wine, girls too thin from neglect, sheets that smell of old sweat. They come here because we offer something else. Clean rooms, pleasant company, a sense of discretion, and refinement. That is worth more than any handful of coins. It keeps us fed, keeps coal in the scuttles, and boots on your feet. You'd all do well to remember it." Her gaze passed slowly from face to face, lingering just long enough to ensure the point struck home. When it finally landed on you, your heart gave a small, guilty flutter, even though you'd done nothing wrong. That was her power. She could remind you with a single glance of exactly how delicate your place here truly was. Then, almost as if she'd flicked a switch, she sat back and allowed the smallest smile to crease her lips. "Now, enjoy these last few moments of calm. The night waits for none of us." A ripple of relieved laughter circled the table, soft and slightly breathless. Lily leaned over and bumped her shoulder against yours, whispering, "She means it kindly, even if it sounds like we're off to war."
"It feels a bit like it," you whispered back, your fingers tracing the edge of your goblet. The wine had left a faint stain on your lips, a tiny flush in your veins that did little to quiet the flutter in your chest. Still, there was something almost comforting in this ritual too. The solid table under your hands, the murmur of familiar voices, even Mrs. Cartwright's brisk little speech. It made what came next feel less like stepping alone into uncertainty and more like joining ranks with your small, strange family, all of you bound by the same tenuous promises. When the plates were cleared and Betsy came by with a final pass of the wine jug, you accepted the small top-up gratefully. You raised your glass in a half-serious toast, echoed by Lily and Josephine. For a brief, bright moment, you let yourself simply sit there in the candlelight, warm and surrounded by laughter. The tension of the coming hours held at bay by bread, stew, and the quiet solidarity of women who knew exactly what it meant to face the night together. When supper ended and the table was cleared, the house slipped into a different sort of motion, one that was smoother, almost rehearsed, each of you falling into familiar patterns as though pulled along invisible threads. It was the hour when the illusion sharpened from careful promise into full spectacle, when every last detail had to shimmer just right. Upstairs, your shared room filled with the quiet rush of fabric and faint, breathless laughter. Gowns and soft jewel shades lay draped across beds and chairs, catching the lamplight in little glints that seemed to dance with every movement. Your own dress tonight was a dark plum satin, its bodice cut to lift and shape with a precision that bordered on art. As you stepped into it, Lily helped guide the fabric up over your shoulders, careful of the delicate trim. "Deep breath," she murmured behind you, fingers already finding the laces of your corset. You obeyed, bracing your palms on the edge of the washstand, eyes closing as she pulled. The stays hugged in tight, drawing a line from rib to hip that felt almost cruel at first, until the second or third breath when your body settled into the constraint as though remembering an old dance. The corset did half the work of the evening before you ever spoke a word. It shaped not only your figure, but the way you held yourself, shoulders squared, neck long, every step becoming something deliberate and careful. "There," Lily said with satisfaction, giving the final knot a little pat. "Makes you look like you stepped stray out of one of those painted cards."
You turned and offered a wry grin. "Just so long as no one's rude enough to peek behind the canvas." Lily laughed, her eyes bright. Then she turned her attention to her own reflection, fingers swiftly pinning stray curls back into the loose knot atop her head. Across the room, Josephine stood before the cracked mirror, dusting her shoulders with a tiny puff of scented powder that left a faint shimmer on her pale skin. Emily, humming under her breath, fussed over a tiny stain at the hem of her gown, finally pinching it between her nails with a huff that suggested this was far from the first such frustration. The air itself grew thicker with preparations, the subtle sweetness of lavender water and warm beeswax from candles, the sharper note of rouge and little ceramic pots, and underneath it all, the faint tang of starch from freshly pressed skirts. It was a perfume of transformation, the house building itself up scent by scent into something rich and inviting. You leaned in close to the mirror and traced a careful line of color across your lips, then pressed them together lightly, hoping to spread them evenly. Lily moved behind you again, this time with the tiny glass bottle of violets and amber scent. She dabbed a bit at your wrists, then tapped the hollow at your throat, her fingers cool and delicate. "For luck," she said, meeting your gaze in the mirror. You caught the glint there, not mischief now, but something steadier, a promise that you weren't walking into this alone. A knock sounded at the doorframe, and Betsy poked her head in. "Parlor's ready. Mrs. Cartwright says she'll start bringing them up soon. Best not keep her waiting." "Nearly done," you called, voice lighter than your heartbeat. You stood, smoothing your skirts, feeling the weight of the satin ripple down to your ankles. The corset pulled your posture into its elegant lie, and when you inhaled, it was the scent of your own perfumed skin that filled your nose, a heady little thrill that almost felt like power. Together, you all filed out into the hall, skirts brushing, hands darting to straighten seams or tuck in loose pins. There was a hush among you now, not frightened exactly, but taut, the way a rope draws tight between two hands. At the top of the stairs, Lily caught your hand for a quick squeeze. Josephine offered a shy smile. Even Emily, always so quick with her sly remarks, only touched your shoulder briefly before stepping ahead. And then you were moving down the staircase, into the glow of the lamps, into the space that waited hungry for your arrival. The parlor had been transformed yet again, the small tables set with shining glasses, the fire dancing brightly on the hearth, sherry already breathing its soft warmth into the air. Mrs. Cartwright stood near the entrance, her sharp eyes sweeping over each of you as though taking silent stock. You felt her gaze pause on you, and for just a heartbeat it seemed to soften, approving. Then she turned to greet the first guest who stepped through the door, her own smile slipping effortlessly into place. Beside you, Lily exhaled a little laugh that didn't quite reach humor. "And so it begins," she whispered. You nodded, shoulders squaring as if by instinct. The dress, the powder, the scent, all of it settled into you now, becoming your skin, your breath, the carefully cultivated softness of your mouth as you turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps. Whatever else waited beyond these next hours, whatever private fears still flickered beneath your ribs, none of it showed. Instead, you let your lips curl into that gentle, welcoming shape you'd practiced so many nights before. Your eyes lifted, bright with borrowed light, and you stepped forward into the room, each movement smooth and gracious, every laugh or glance precisely measured, part of the delicate clockwork that kept the house alive, one ordered tick at a time. The night unfolded the way it always did, a slow unfurling of velvet and murmured voices, of laughter that was just a little too bright. It began gently enough, with the rustle of skirts across the parlor carpet, the chime of glasses meeting in polite toasts. Men came through the door one by one, or in pairs,
each bringing with him the chill of the street, the faint spice of tobacco, and that look you learned to recognize, searching, hopeful, sometimes calculating, sometimes simply lost. You stood near the small table set with decanters, Lily at your side, both of you playing the part with practiced ease. When Mrs. Cartwright led over a gentleman with thinning hair and nervous hands, you offered your smile as though it belonged only to him. He stammered a little when he introduced himself, Mr. Digby, and fumbled his sherry so badly a drop landed on your glove. His face turned scarlet, apologies spilling out faster than you could reassure him. You found yourself patting his arm gently, coaxing him into a chair by the hearth, pouring his drink yourself so his shaking fingers wouldn't have to. By the time you guided him upstairs, his breathing had steadied, though he still glanced at you like he couldn't quite believe his luck. With him, it was all whispered questions. Was he too heavy? Was he doing it wrong? Did you mind? You answered each in soft, careful tones, pressing his hand when it trembled, watching his shoulders finally slump into a sort of shy relief. Later came a man with a voice like gravel and a diamond pin at his throat that seemed gaudy even in the dim candlelight. He didn't bother with the parlor long, only tossed off half a glass of port before catching your wrist and drawing you close with a firm, impersonal grip. His breath smelled of expensive brandy gone sour. Upstairs, he was all brisk orders, rough hands that adjusted your shoulders this way and that, as though arranging a shop display. It wasn't cruel exactly. He paid promptly, didn't linger to gloat or degrade. But when the door shut behind him, you let out a breath you hadn't realized you'd been holding, wiping a sleeve across the back of your neck where his palm had rested too long. There were stranger visitors, too, a pale young man who insisted on reciting poetry even as he reached to undo your stays, his voice cracking with earnest fervor over lines about moonlight and devotion. You lay there with his weight half on your shoulder, listening as he mangled some sonnet, and found yourself almost touched, despite the absurdity of it, how desperately he seemed to want romance to live here in this narrow rented room. When he left, he pressed a silver coin into your palm, as though it were some sacred offering, eyes shining with something you couldn't quite name. Another brought a carefully wrapped parcel from a patisserie in Soho, which he offered up with the solemn pride of a child giving flowers. It was a tiny cake dusted with sugar, delicate and absurd in such a setting. You thanked him as though it were a royal gift, and later shared it with Lily in the dark, each bite a small, sweet rebellion against the heaviness of the evening. And then there were those who never quite spoke at all, only nodded or grunted, their eyes distant, hands efficient. With them you let your mind drift, counting the breaths, the panels of the cracked ceiling, the faint tick of the small clock on the mantel, until it was done and they were smoothing their coats again, pressing coins into your hand without quite meeting your gaze.
But sprinkled among these were moments that confused your heart, that left you strangely tender or faintly bruised in ways no corset could disguise. A kindly older man who wept softly afterward, clutching your hand as if you alone could save him from some ghost he would not name. A broad-shouldered clerk who blushed bright red when you unbuttoned his waistcoat, so earnest in his gratitude afterward that you almost laughed for sheer surprise. Their warmth was a delicate, fleeting thing, like a candle flame caught between cupped hands, there and gone again, but bright enough to leave after-images dancing behind your eyes. By the time the lamps burned low and the house began its gradual easing into silence, your body felt both heavy and oddly insubstantial, as if you'd given away some small piece of yourself to each man who passed through your door. You washed carefully at the basin, watching rouge and scent swirl away into cloudy water, then smoothed your nightdress down over skin that was still
faintly humming with the echoes of other hands. And as you finally settled under your thin coverlet, Lily's quiet breathing steady across the room, you closed your eyes and tried to gather yourself back together. All the scattered fragments of laughter, forced gasps, gentle reassurances. It was an odd sort of inventory, counting up what the night had taken and what small surprises it had offered in return. Somehow, through it all, you remained intact. Tired, yes, and threaded through with complicated ache, but still wholly yours beneath the powder and silk, waiting to rise again with the gray light of morning. When the last door had closed behind the final visitor, the house exhaled in a long, weary sigh that seemed to echo down every quiet corridor. It was always this way, an hour or two after midnight, the front parlor empty save for a few stray glasses on small tables, the scent of wine and cologne still clinging to the drapes. The bright illusion carefully crafted through the evening now slipped, settling into gentle disorder. You found yourself in the upstairs hall with Lily, each of you carrying a pile of soiled linens that still held the heat of bodies and faint traces of perfume. The rooms you passed were in various stages of being made right again, windows cracked to let in the cold bite of fresh air, wash bowls standing ready, beds stripped bare. It was a quiet work that asked little of you beyond your hands, and in that simplicity there was something almost comforting. You moved from room to room, smoothing fresh sheets, dabbing away stray marks with water, checking candles so only safe stubs remained. By the time you descended back to the ground floor, your satin dress felt like a stranger's skin draped over your shoulders. In the little side hall near the kitchen, you paused to peel it off, fingers working at the hooks with practiced tugs. The corset came next, each loosened string a small flood of relief, until at last you stood in only your shift, able to draw a true, deep breath. The silk lay puddled at your feet, the delicate boning resting on a chair, and you ran your hands lightly over your ribs, marveling again at how easily the shape of you changed back into something soft and breathing. The kitchen was still warm, the stove banked but not dead, giving off a gentle heat that lapped at your chilled ankles. Betsy had left out a small pot of tea and some slices of bread wrapped in a cloth to keep them tender. Lily joined you a moment later, her hair tumbled down her back, eyes heavy but content. "Long night," she murmured, sinking into the chair across from you. You only nodded, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. The tea was weak, but it carried a faint sweetness that settled your stomach. Across the table, Lily tucked her feet up under her and closed her eyes for a moment, a small smile teasing the edge of her mouth. "Reckon tomorrow will be quieter. That crowd tonight, half of them don't have coin left for a second evening so soon." "That suits me just fine," you admitted. Your voice sounded almost shy in the hush that filled the kitchen now that the house was no longer performing. Outside the mirror window, London lay wrapped in fog, lamps throwing blurred halos across the empty street. There was something special about this hour. The house stripped of its glamour, girls gathered in twos and threes around cooling cups, barefooted and soft-voiced. Without corsets and paint, you all looked startlingly young again, as though by shedding the gowns you'd shed half your practiced caution, too. And it was here, in these dim corners, that hopes found their voice. Emily slipped in from the hall, hair still pinned in a crooked twist, and settled on the bench with a sigh that seemed to spill her whole self across the table. "If I ever get out of this place," she said dreamily, "I'd open a little shop. Ribbons, lace, maybe a few clever hats. Somewhere by the river, so you'd smell the water every morning."
Josephine appeared next, drawn by the promise of warmth, her hands cupped together as if in prayer. "I'd keep hens," she whispered, with a quiet intensity that made Lily laugh gently. "Just imagine it. Fresh eggs, a garden, no voices calling you to hurry." You listened, pressing your cup close to your lips so they couldn't see the way they quivered with sudden longing. Because in the darkest hours, when your bed was still warm from a stranger's weight, you dreamed it too. A sunlit yard, your own small door to open at the end of the day. No need for paint or practiced laughter. Maybe even the sea beyond a low stone wall, endless and clean. At last Lily stretched, joints cracking faintly. "Come on then," she said, voice soft but insistent. "Best try for sleep before dawn's too close upon us." You stood, pressing your hand briefly to the table's scarred wood, as though to promise you'd return to this simple peace. The halls were dim as you made your way back up, the carpets muffling your steps. At your door, you and Lily paused, exchanging small, tired grins that needed no words. Inside, you slipped into your narrow bed with a tiny sigh, pulling the thin blanket up to your chin. The mattress still held a faint impression of the day's start, a reminder that life here was a circle of the same hours over and over. Yet for tonight, you let that worry drift. The kitchen's warmth clung to you still, and your mind turned not to guests or ledgers, but to gardens and waves and small wooden shops with bright painted signs. And as sleep finally claimed you, it was those gentle dreams that carried you off, leaving the midnight house to settle once more into its own careful, sighing rest.